Pi Ian. He's an independent economic and geopolitical researcher and an expert in geoeconomic trends between East and West for over 20 years. So he's just the man that we want to talk to. And I'm grateful, Pi, for you joining us this evening on the Mother of All talk shows. Speak to the Iran issue first, if you would. Let's assume that the events overnight in Baghdad have not derailed the agreement that appears to be reached in Vienna to reinstate Iran into the world, to lift the sanctions and restart the JCPOA.
Thank you for having me on, George, and it's a pleasure. With regard to Iran, and just very briefly, my personal sentiment is that the demands made that will be made by the Iranian government will ultimately be deemed intolerable by NATO partners as well as their allies in turn, regionally or otherwise. And that is somewhat reflective of the fact that Iran, along with its closer Eurasian partners, have a game played out what has been happening over the past month or so well in advance, have had their demands acutely prepared with regard to the fallout resulting, and will signal to each other that they're not going to, quote unquote, necessarily sell each other out. So I think it'll be not as simplified as maybe some transatlantic corporate mainstream press may be making it out to be with regard to Iran, as well as Venezuela and others previously deemed as, quote unquote, rogue nations that all of a sudden now, in a 180-degree turn or near that, are being considered for a myriad of reasons to be re-engaged with. But I wanted to touch base about much deeper risks that are somewhat related to Iran, but more so to really kind of verboten issues between East and West. I traded precious metals commodities, both physical bullion, gold and silver, platinum and palladium, as well as on margin for years. Doing so, one gets a very on-the-tracks education or re-education away from theoretical finance and economics because of the finite physical nature of what said commodities are. So there's an aggressive currency war behind the Russia-Ukraine conflict, yet the stakes are so high that neither East nor West want details to be understood by wider markets or the masses. Very little of the $121 billion that Russian entities owe to Western banks is likely to be ever repaid now that war has started. And
might be repaid in rubles.
Well, you know, that's questionable then with regard to financial institutions and their receptivity to non-dollar payment. That's really at the core of what's happening. These unprecedented sanctions that are applied are going to draw into question what the gamesmanship is going to be between not just Moscow, but its tightest partners, foremost Beijing, as well as the collective transatlantic, certainly financial community. International banks are owed more than that $121 billion amount by the Russian entities per the Bank for International Settlements in Switzerland itself, which, as you know, is the central bank of central banks. And the BIS suspended Russia's membership just last Thursday, which is very telling. They're supposed to be, you know, the central bank to everything and neutral, and in Switzerland. So the U.S. and European Union have also blocked Russia's central bank from utilizing something like 40% of its $630 billion in reserves. Yet the overall amount of credit exposure that European banks per se could potentially experience is imminently devastating, in my opinion. One has to ask if these sanctions are purely punitive or if they're actually defensive moves, considering long-standing Russian and Chinese ambitions for usurping the 78-year-old global dollar reserve standard and the 49-year-old petrodollar reserve recycling standard following Nixon's closing of the gold window 51 years ago. I mean, the vast majority of the more than, I think, like 15 trillion with a T dollars worth of reserves held by nations or in paper and digital money, while a much, much smaller amount is held in gold and other investment assets. Yet, with the exception of gold, the other reserve assets are someone else's liability ultimately, meaning someone like, oh, I don't know, the U.S. Treasury, who can just decide on a whim that they're not worth anything, often in scenarios involving economic or hot wars against deemed rogue nations, can throw that at those rogue nations. Now, what NATO allies have done by blocking Russian banks from accessing reserves is demonstrate the actual risk of holding paper or currency reserves for the rest of the world as well. These risks are driving Russian and Chinese pushes to buy physical money, i.e. gold, finite, physical, limited, tangible metal. You can't just suspend the meaning of money to a nation, especially one with low debt, I mean, endless natural resources, nukes, and rich friends like China, which is further internationalizing its own renminbi currency, mind you. So China will aggressively settle Russian energy trading in its own currency, moving away from dollar dependence, and tie it all to gold in partnership, again, with Russia. This has been years in the planning. Alternatives to the SWIFT money transfer system will be strengthened as a result of these newer sanctions as well. Chinese-Russian trade settlement in dollars had already dropped from 90% in 2015 to half of that in 2020. Western sanctions will further solidify the Russian-Chinese gold and oil money alliance, if you will. And both Eurasian nations have clearly, again, game played out, war gamed out recently how to speed it all up. Here's the danger as far as institutions are concerned. Kinetic currency war moves faster than what existing financial transaction settlement intermediation chains can keep up with, making it hard to know exactly what and where risk exposures remain in the actual financial system. So domino effects can thus be delayed but still prove catastrophic. Hence why Deutsche Bank stock dropped, not coincidentally, nearly 40% over the past month alone. It's all going to spiral out of control for transatlantic financial institutions, and a solvency crisis rivaling 2008's financial crisis will more than likely result, at the very least. Financial contagion can and will spread, considering obscene levels of opaque derivatives exposure in the tens of trillions of dollars plaguing the largest bulge bracket banks, and the fact that tactically suppressed gold and silver prices will need to adjust much higher, which in turn will tweak delicately hedged finance across these largest investment banks. Also, and critically, and you know this better than most, Russia and China want the petrodollar standard replaced, but they're not exactly like Iraq under Saddam or Libya under Gaddafi, meaning that the military muscle assured 49 years ago for enforcing that petrodollar reserve recycling currency standard will not work this time around. Ukraine's inability to deflect Russian forces is displaying that reality bluntly.
There's so much in that that we could spend the next 2 hours unpicking it. It was brilliant in the way that you toured the horizon there. Let me ask you, as it were, a plain man's question. Why did Russia allow such a significant percentage of its reserves to be in, effectively, Western banks that could be seized, when, if you say they've been planning these kind of things for years, and they certainly must have planned this Ukraine operation for months at least, why did they not move that substantial part of their reserves out of these Western banks?
Questions, and it really speaks to the nature of counterparty risk and the gamesmanship that I referenced earlier. Russia, China, these ancient nations are used to long games, as are the wealthiest, most powerful, and most private families, dynasties, and oligarchs out west. And hence, perhaps the longer game entailed setting placements for assuring a counterparty risk for such a catastrophic event like the past month, or accelerating rate of sanctions applied and other measures of currency war applied, or of economic warfare or blockades applied, meaning that if you have your pieces set up in the other camp's domain, then, as I mentioned at the outset of the call, you want to apply sanctions against us? Fine, settle everything in rubles, as you had referenced. Oh, and by the way, you can't do that. So it will ricochet back against the institutions that carry that risk. It's been a very, this is the thing that I'm mentioning. It's forbidden from being detailed in a non-opaque fashion, certainly in the financial press. Because, as you know, everything is a confidence game. So if you give indications that actually risk parameters are at an exponential level higher than what is being described, even with the volatility within equity markets and elsewhere over the past month, then, why do you think the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Iranians, the Venezuelans have not just an open ear, but a policy receptivity to a non-dollar priced and traded and reserve recycled oil, natural gas, and minerals? Is because everyone kind of tacitly has an awareness, foremost including Western central banks and the private banks owning them, that there is a shelf life, if you will, to the dollar standard. It's just a matter of trying to get out of that standard in a controlled fashion that may or may not include, central bank digital currencies, may or may not include, blockchain platforms for graduating, if you will, away from the post-Bretton Woods order. And that's really then the question of, is the East challenging the credibility of the West to have that sense of graduation away from the post-Bretton Woods order? Or are they saying, look, Russia, the first is number one in reserves as far as natural gas in the world, is number two in production. For oil, it's, I think, seventh in reserves and second in production. I'm sorry, Russia's first in both reserves and production, as seventh in oil reserves and second in oil production. And China, I don't need to tell you about their productivity capacity, manufacturing strengths, inherent wealth, ability to innovate rather than just imitate as they had in decades prior. So they're legitimately claiming the right to take the baton away from the West as far as establishing the newer monetary order. And that's really underlying the hot war, kinetic war that's happening. Those are the stakes. But because, it affects confidence, it could potentially trigger dollar flight. They're expected, it's better to keep them under wraps and just kind of keep showing these images, both, again, from the East and the West with regard to Ukraine acutely, as well as these other ancillary states. But expect the stakes, because as high as they are, to worsen macroeconomically, for stagflation to exacerbate transatlantically. And I only fear that because the stakes are so high financially from the Western perspective, there is an intolerance for allowing, hence these claims that there needs to be regime change immediately in Moscow, Putin needs to be assassinated. You speak like that, psychologically projecting the level of the stakes involved. And the stakes are not just with regard to, violating the sovereignty of nations that the West wants in Nato. They are much deeper, much longer standing, and much more macroeconomic in nature.
From all that you've said, it would seem to me that the prospect of the Russian entities allowing their debts to Western entities to go bad would be the least of the problems. This truly is the apocryphal, perhaps, lifting of a huge stone only to drop it on our own feet. It looks like our leaders have made a gigantic blunder.
You could have the smartest minds in London, in Washington, in Brussels, and in Basel. I sense the mathematical inertia of what had initially been set forth inevitably results in some level of insolvency that needs to be addressed in a fashion that in an ideal world, everyone sits at the table and negotiates. But that's intolerable because of wider geostrategic and geopolitical aims by Atlanticist nations. And hence, I sense the hot war will get much worse because the obedience that is expected out of everybody is being challenged head on by very both economically and militarily powerful nations. And by militarily, I lean more toward the sense that they're nuclear armed, unlike the previously mentioned Libya under Gaddafi, or Caracas or Tehran, or certainly the nations that had been occupied just over the past 22 years alone. So calmer heads, adults in the room, if you will, need to really innovate in the sense of how do we avoid global catastrophe, world war, and nuclear fallout? Because Putin's very calculated. He's not going to just throw out the term nuclear and just for gamesmanship, considering his own population, considering the reality of responses that could result. But that is, he was essentially outlining his version of the Samson option, Israel's Samson option. Israel wasn't alone as far as like, look, if we face complete existential threats, X, Y, and Z is what we're willing to resort to. And you just had the equivalent, essentially, from the largest nation on the planet, 11 time zones, which is convinced that NATO is aiming not just to encircle it, but ultimately occupy it, regime change it, balkanize it, resource appropriate it to an exponential of what had happened during the Yeltsin years. So it's beyond an existential threat to them. And that needs to be taken very seriously by, I will emphasize this phrase, the owners of capital transatlantically. And they know who they are, and they know what the stakes are.
Pi, Ian, I suspect that anyone who watched this interview will never, ever forget it. It's been a remarkable pleasure to hear you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.